Did you know that there's a difference between culture fit and culture climate? I didn't even know there was such a difference.
What culture really is what the business or leadership have kind of written on the wall or on the website. Climate is actually what's happening when you get inside the context of the four walls, behind the Zoom, whatever it is. So it's the perception, it's the employee experience. Now, how does that play out in an example? You can schedule a doctor's appointment during working hours without using a vacation day. But the climate actually says, but that might not be the case with all managers. So you're going to have to check with yours once you get onboarded. That's a disconnect. Culture is telling me, hey, we care about you and your health. But the reality, the experience is that it's on a manager by manager basis.
The idea of job security is outdated as a landline. If you haven't been in a search for a while, it's probable you will at some point, by choice or not. Most executives admit to staying way too long or sense what's coming and justify staying anyway. There's another reason. The faulty belief that navigating to what's next will inevitably be worse and has to suck. Screw that. Loren has spent a lifetime in corporate and executive search, calling bullshit on stale career advice that most still use. This is Career Blast in a Half, the career podcast for executives ready to cut past outdated career advice to fuel your outcomes now. So let's go.
Did you know that there's a difference between culture fit and culture climate? So I'm raising my hand. You may not be able to see me right now, but long story short, I didn't even know that there was such a difference. And that's why today's episode with Dr. Colleen Saringer is super important. Whether you are in the market, whether you are already in a job and you're thinking to yourself, I thought I was a culture fit, but now there's more to this than just like being alike, right? There's other factors that are at place. So I'm going to have Dr. Saringer or Colleen introduce herself and get into this topic, but this is all surrounding a bigger issue: mental health in the workplace, mental health advocacy, something that many of us, including myself, again, were told had no place in the workplace. So, phew, thank goodness you're here in all your glory and your beautiful tan. Dr. Colleen Saringer, thank you so much for not just coming on the show today, but really, really sticking to your guns and supporting so many small businesses, people who are in blue collar industries or, areas where a lot of this stuff is kind of dismissed. So, can you share a little bit more about who you are and how you actually stumbled into this area of expertise?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I always have to say this, Loren, thank you so much for the invitation. I mean, it's just an honor to be invited to someone's table. So thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure.
So just I'll do a quick introduction of who I am. I consider myself an organizational health professional, and I do think there's an importance in saying that because I'm not HR, and that is not to frown upon HR. It is two very different things from a department standpoint and from the overall kind of end game. And so I do think it's important to clarify that, and we could save that conversation for a whole nother podcast. So ultimately, I tend to call myself a blue collar woman wrapped in a PhD package. And I say
Mm.
that because as you teed me up, I have spent time weathering the challenges of two family-owned construction businesses. So although I can put on a pretty dress and a nice pair of high heels and feel like a powerhouse, I also understand what it's like to get your hands dirty. So ultimately, I grew up with my parents running a sheet metal business, small business out of Cleveland, Ohio, which is why I always label myself this blue collar woman. And then my husband, he is also a small business construction owner here in Atlanta, Georgia. And there is a lot that comes from small business ownership. It is ultimately it feels like a one person's job a lot of the time. Because when you have that small business ownership, you do feel as though every decision you make could have a negative or positive impact, which often means you're afraid to let things go, right?
Mm.
And so through all of that and watching my parents and watching my husband specifically in this extremely challenging industry of construction where things like mental health, because it's such a male dominated industry, they don't tend to talk about feelings or talk about emotions. They tend to suppress them. So that's how I landed focusing really just in this construction space. But overall, from a workplace standpoint, this is all I know. This is the industry I've been working in. I've been working in the workplace, specifically through the lens of bettering the organization from a health standpoint for 25 years. So, gosh, in 2009 is when I went back and got my PhD because I thought I'm going to really put dig my heels into the ground on this one and see if we can actually make some change happen. So, I've been at it for a long time.
And I just have to ask you, this is a little bit of a loaded question. Is mental health advocacy getting better or worse?
That is a good loaded question. So I will answer it. This is totally from my purview, right? So I do believe, and I want to preface and say that the pandemic had a lot of negative that came from it, right? I'm always going to say that. But there was a lot of positive that came from the pandemic. One of which was it did put a spotlight on something that has always been there and needed an opportunity to have a light shown on it because we are not
Mm.
doing enough. Um, so that's kind of how I would answer it there. But my goodness gracious, when I think about social media and this, the US Surgeon General even put out some new conversation around social media and the impact that it's having on mental health. I think we have a really long way to go, just because we have a new element that we need
Mm.
to focus on. And there's always going to be new elements, right? But we can't put our head in the sand. I think we did that for a little bit too long. So we're making way. I think we still have a long way to go.
So, if you had to select your top three, what are the three most prevalent, common, and maybe systemically icky areas of mental health in the workplace that we all need to be aware of, especially as many of our listeners are in leadership roles, whether they're in a blue collar environment or whether they are working for somebody who may be inflicting some of these actual issues? What are the top three?
So can I zoom out for a second?
Yes.
Okay, can I take my nerdy kind of PhD mind and zoom out for a second? And then I promise
Yeah.
I will come in, and this might be a fun time to explain the difference between culture and climate, and then go
Please,
down like
please,
another tree branch to
please.
the three. Okay.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Okay. So stick with me on this one.
We are.
Okay. So before we can even get to the three, I think that again we have to zoom out and understand that the workplace itself is what we refer to in my nerdy world as a determinant of health. Okay.
Mm,
So in other words, what that means in some kind of the most basic terminology is that we often go to the behavior. So the question that you ask, what are the three potential things to look at? That's a behavior, right? That's one example. The other types of behaviors are again stress, anxiety, depression. We immediately go to the behavior. But
mhm.
what we forget, is that things like, um, do we have social support from our family or friends? What type of religion do we identify, and what are the rules of that religion? Um, um, what type of I said social support. What type of family kind of requirements am I following? And or how is my workplace set up to make me successful or not? And so
Mm.
that's the zooming out part, because all of those things influence, do I have anxiety? Do I have
Mm.
depression? What is it doing to my, overall kind of health? But we immediately go to the behavior when we forget that we have to that we need to zoom out to say there are all these things that are influencing the behavior, right? So that is my whole point of the workplace being
Mm.
one of these factors. And so
Mm-hmm.
then that then takes us down to the culture and climate piece. So to your point earlier, you're familiar with culture, but
Everybody's familiar with, like, and especially, in the area that in my lane, right? Everybody's like, oh, every prospect, oh, I'm looking for a great culture fit. And it has become a vernacular. It's become a placeholder in many cases for a lot of other things. So, warning, warning, like, just don't flip it around and think that
yes,
everybody understands your flavor and or version of what culture fit means, because of course there's lots of cultures in a culture fit, and you
yes,
want to make sure that you're on the same page.
yes. And I love that you called that out, because it's becoming a bigger buzzword than I think it has ever been. And right. And so, okay. So culture, when we hear, myself included, say that, what culture really is what the business or leadership have kind of written on the wall or on the website, right? That's culture. Climate is actually what's happening when you get inside the context of the four walls, behind the Zoom, whatever it is. So it's the perception, it's the employee experience. Now, how does that play out in an example? And I think that's important, right? So I'll share a couple of examples that you may or may not have heard me say before. So, culture example one: you can schedule a doctor's appointment during working hours without using a vacation day. But the climate, when we peel the layer of the onion back, actually says, but that might not be the case with all managers. So you're going to have to check with yours, once you get onboarded. That's a disconnect. Culture is telling me, hey, we care about you and your health, but the reality, the experience is that it's on a manager by manager basis,
Right. You
right?
gotta you gotta prove yourself to go to the
Right.
doctor.
Right. So let's just give one more, and then I'll get to some of the other
Sure.
things, right? So here's another one. This is one of my favorites, just because I experienced it myself. Culture. We have a zero tolerance policy for workplace harassment. Climate. But one of our salespeople is really terrible, and unfortunately, everyone has to pay their dues and work with them. It's a disconnect. Do you really care about the harassment or not? Right? So when we talk about culture and climate, and some of the three biggest things based on what the writing that is on your wall, I want to make sure that you are eliminating bullying and sexual harassment, because that does impact the health of a person in regards to depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation. We're going to say the word because we have to. um, Things like pressure, that pressure to work those long hours, right? Saying, coming in early, leaving late, because that's what I'm seeing in who's rubbing elbows with leadership and getting the promotions.
Mm.
So that's the other big one that I would say.
Yeah, I was just about to say that sounds like climate to me, where they, throw around the work-life balance, and then that's all fine and well until you realize that they can put that in some employee manual all day long, but people are literally sweatshopping it out, right?
Yes, yes. So, and it really is kind of like the third one then that I would lead to, because I do think this kind of ties into all of it, is setting the expectation that all leaders and managers are showing empathy, respect, and appreciation. So when that isn't there, when I feel that I have this rub with my manager, or we're not seeing eye to eye, or same with my colleagues, that's another researched proven factor that actually impacts anxiety, depression, and suicide ideation.
Mm.
So for me, when I think about what are those kind of top three, there's a few others, but it's always going to be the ones that we know research has proven to actually influence some of these negative implications on a human.
Okay. I'm like breathing very heavily. It's not the climate in here at all. It's just it's a lot, right? Like this isn't here to say every organization is screwed, but it is a hey, like if you we're going with this whole like climate culture thing, right? Like here's a flag, and of course I'm going to have to ask this, but how now that we're in a job search and we're reading all this stuff and we're talking to all these people and we're interviewing and we're networking, how do we suss out which C word it is?
Yeah, so I was actually jotting down a couple of notes before we got on the call together. Excuse me. So I call it Colleen-topia. It's like if I had my own make believe perfect world. So in Colleen-topia, I would encourage that every individual do what I love to call a drive, like not a drive by, but kind of like a ride along type thing, where you get the opportunity to work with work with someone inside the context of the workplace for a day. Now I know that's not going to happen. Again, that's Colleen-topia. But where I do think there's opportunity is to, because I think that this will also give you a feel down the road, is to ask who is interviewing you. Can I have an opportunity to speak with others that currently work with inside the organization? Their yes or no to me says a lot. They should already have individuals kind of teed up in the background to speak to individuals that are looking to be hired by. So I would nudge for that for sure. If that's a yes, I would ask things like, what really happens during time off? So, am I
Mhm.
allowed to unplug, or is it the expectation, and I'm speaking more from a white collar seat, is the expectation that my phone's available because for text?
Mhm.
That's not time off, right? Texting me on vacation is not time off. So
Mhm.
I would dig into those policies. So what really happens when I request time off and when I have time off? I would ask about those doctor's appointments because that then gets into family needs. What if my child is
Mhm.
sick, right? Things like that. Bereavement policies are a big one for me. If you were to lose someone in how you define family, I would dig into what a company's bereavement policy is. That to me sets a
Mm.
totally different tone from a workplace culture and climate
Right, because
standpoint.
you could lose your dog or your
Yes.
pet, and that's family, right?
Yes, yes. And again, that's a personal near and dear one for me, but I think the other thing, if we could go there for a second, what if you're a woman and you suffer a miscarriage, right? That's a loss. Or what if you have a failed adoption? That's a
Mm.
loss, right? So to me, how is bereavement qualified and quantified, and what happens if I do need to take time off? So to me, that's another, I would go deep into that policy. Um, Feedback and promotions, how I had mentioned that a little bit earlier, right? Do I need to be rubbing elbows with leadership in
Mm.
order to be, or are there objective goals behind how I get to the next step? And then the other one is, and this one might raise an eyebrow for some, tenure. It could be a
Mm.
good thing. It could also be a bad thing, right? Because if there's strong tenure, there may be a lot of in-group groupthink. There might not be
Mhm.
a lot of diversity. And so, are you really going to have an opportunity to make impact or change, or whatever the case may be, based on what it is that you're
Mhm.
interviewing for? So, just to take a step back, again, I would say if I get the opportunity to speak to someone in the workplace, those are the things I would push on from a culture versus climate standpoint. If you don't get that opportunity, then I would seek someone out on LinkedIn and ask some questions.
Mm. So, couple questions there. So, when you're looking at tenure, I always think of it, there's kind of like a double-edged sword there. On one hand, it could say, great, like there's job security to the extent that there actually is some of that today, which is not a lot. Maybe I should say there's the opportunity for longevity at one company. And it also, sadly, could be like they're just not necessarily that interested in innovation, and those people could also be very susceptible to being let go. So, make sure that you're looking at it. I know that the insights tab on any of those company profiles will also share some of that as well. But you may want to probe even deeper for what that means. Is there a question there that would be helpful for anybody who is kind of assessing culture climate with respect to tenure?
Yeah, so I think for me the 10 where I would go for tenure is tell me again. I always go to policy, and it may be because that's just where a lot of my research and stuff stands, but I always go to policy in the sense of when was the
Mm,
last time you had a what's the word I'm looking for? When was the last time you had an operational change happen? What
mm,
was the operational change? Did it
mm,
sustain itself or not?
mm,
Because what often
mm.
happens in operation when there is a lot of tenure is there is pushback on change from an
Mhm.
operational standpoint, whether it's again how people are, we'll use the hot topic, how people are coming back to work or not, or whatever the case may be, or maybe it's even the use of an internal sales system. If that
Mm.
can't be sustained for more than 1 year, or leadership isn't pushing to sustain it, they're
Ooh, that's
saying,
really good.
you know what, this just isn't working. That to me says they like to keep things the way they are.
Mm.
So I think, again, I
Mhm.
think it to me, I like to go deep into policy, something that really needed sustainment and change.
Mm. That's really, really helpful. I like that a lot because it also takes it off of a personality, right? It
Yes.
takes it, it puts it into precedent versus, you know, this manager, that manager, yada, yada, yada. So that's
Yeah.
really helpful.
Thank you.
So you mentioned to me that you also had a framework, and I would love for you to share that framework with us because this topic is kind of like hard to wrangle, and
Yeah.
it probably has some squishy aspects. So how do you put some clarity, maybe even structure around it?
Yeah. So I know, so not to, I just want to take a step back because I know since we're talking about culture climate, but also talking a lot about mental health, just so not to confuse, when I'm
Yes.
talking about these topics, at the end of the day, I do believe that the mental health piece sits at the root of so many of our workplace needs,
Mm,
culture and climate being the key one, right? Like based on what I said. So or earlier in regards to the things that impact health, suicide ideation, all that stuff. I just wanted to clarify that for a second as to
so
why.
helpful. Yes.
So and also because that plays into the framework, which I call it a 360-degree workplace advocacy framework. So I love that you said advocacy in the beginning when we kicked off. But the way that we really move forward, in my personal opinion, is by taking action. And so each one of those letters has a step, right, or has a meaning or a something behind it. And so and then I should also preface and say this, Loren, that this is a me step. Me as in I
Mhm,
have a responsibility as an
mhm,
employee, as a leader, as a business owner, but it's also a
mhm,
we because the me impacts the we, right?
mhm,
So the A is acknowledge and assess. We have to first say, like, gosh, we actually have a problem, right? We have
mhm,
an opportunity. Every workplace has an opportunity.
mhm.
It's just like all of us. We all have an opportunity for something to grow, right? And develop.
Right.
But so we need to do an assessment, and that assessment 100% has to involve the voice of the people. And I am not a survey person. I'm okay using surveys to supplement. But if we are not talking to our employees, we are missing the solution because employees don't need
Mm.
another thing to do by filling out a survey. They want to just tell you and go on with their lives and get home to their families. So acknowledge and assess, that has to happen first. Connect through communication is the C. And so I do believe, and this kind of goes back to one of the questions you asked earlier about mental health today. We have so many ways to connect, but I feel like we are so disconnected from each other because we're not communicating through our voices, right? We're not communicating in person. We've lost just some common practices, right, of just being human.
Mhm.
And so we have an opportunity to really connect through communication. So that's the C. The T is trusting in yourself and then
Mm.
also in others. There's a big still micromanagement challenge. And again, we can
Oh, yeah.
lay this on the whole hybrid and virtual. We can lay it onto that whole conversation. But if you're not trusting others in the workplace, it's probably because there's something you're not trusting in yourself. And so,
In yourself.
yes, because again, it all starts with me. So that T part is the trust in yourself and others and navigating
Mhm.
through that. The I is investing in implementation because the unfortunate thing is a lot of organizations talk about this, but the work, the actually rolling up your sleeves and doing the work, it's really hard and it's scary, right? And it can feel like a huge, like you're boiling the ocean. But we have to pause and pick at least one or three to actually move forward. So it's actually investing in implementation and the voice of your people. They're going to tell you where the opportunities are. That's why that A is so important with the assessment. The O piece is adjustments in how you operate because that is going to
Mm.
happen. The way that you're operating today is going to be different than how you're operating tomorrow, which really the N then stands for normalizing. And now
Mm.
normalizing and bringing that kind of new normal, that word that we all got used to saying after the pandemic, into the
Mhm.
workplace to actually create a healthy organization. So that's the action framework. There's definitely additional kind of like a lot of layers between each one, but those are the things that we're going to tackle throughout or that you can tackle throughout.
So we're going to wrap up in a couple minutes, but I just really want your POV on one small thing each one of us can do to start advocating either for our own mental mental health in the workplace and or in support of other people, be it your boss, a peer, somebody else, even maybe somebody who's reporting into you. Is there one or two things that we could do right when we're done with listening to start that process?
Yeah, I think it starts with self for sure. But if again, to walk away today, and this is going to sound like the most silly statement, Lauren, but it literally goes back to being a kind human. A smile, a good morning, a thank you so much for working hard today. Have a great night.
Mm.
That's it.
And everyone can do that. You
Everyone.
know, since I'm not a big systems and process person, I really appreciate that because it just gives me that one thing to do, even if it's holding a door open or somebody after hours just saying goodnight or whatever that is. Start there and then rinse and repeat,
Yep,
right?
exactly.
Because it really does have an infinite impact if you just keep doing it. Because eventually if you're a leader, they're looking at you even when you're not looking at them. So keep that in mind. And that also can change the culture fit and the climate. So
Yeah.
wow. Thank you so much, so much, Dr. Colleen Saringer, for being here. And make sure that you check out her LinkedIn. Hire her, for goodness sakes. Hire her. She is an amazing speaker. And she also is the host of Build a Bridge. So that's a LinkedIn Live, and you can catch that. You can get all the updates off of her LinkedIn profile, which we will make sure that we include the link. Dr. Saringer, and Colleen, thank you so much for being here. And we'll see you in around the LinkedIn streets.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining today. We appreciate your listening ears. Big time. We ask this: use these tools, not tomorrow, right now, and share them by spreading the love, leaving us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss the next career blast in a half. Most of all, thank you for you.